All right, so let's go ahead and get started with our session on best practices for managing GIS in the era of modern GIS. I'm Jerry Miller, I'm sector lead for the education team. And we also have Peter Knoop at the University of Michigan. So Peter's there on camera as well. So Peter, would you like to introduce yourself? Your mic?
I have to unmute myself. It's the first session of the day. I'll get used to doing that. I'm Peter Knoop. I'm from the University of Michigan, and I'm a research computing consultant there in our College of Literature, Science, and the Arts, and do a lot with managing our ArcGIS system, or do little with managing our ArcGIS system, a lot with helping users.
Exactly. Thank you. And Peter and I have been running these sessions on best practices for last few Ed Summits and at various other occasions. And Peter's taken a lot of the leadership for what you're going to see here. But what we're going to do is kind of go over a couple of logistical things before we begin. You guys, your attendees, are in listen-only mode, so do use the Q&A and the chat, so send questions our way. We'll, of course, address as many of them as we can, and what we cannot, we'll follow up after. The summit with in various ways, such as emails, blogs, and so. Also, some of you might be wondering, we keep getting asked this question. Sessions are being recorded, and the recordings are going to be available on our proceeding site in a couple of weeks. So this session is first in a series of best practices workshops that we have. This one is going to focus on kind of the overall suggestions and recommendations that we have. And the second one is going to include a number of other panelists, and it's going to focus on how we get to the best practices state. And also, now that we're there, how do we support GIS across the campus community? And then the third one is going to focus on providing access to non-SAS components of modern GIS. That is, we often get many questions that pertain to, I want to virtualize ArcGIS, or my students have Mac machines, and it's very sometimes difficult to get applications like ArcGIS Pro running on a Mac. So therefore, we'll cover all of those important concepts. So for this specific session, the outline is, we'll take a look at quick definition of modern GIS. What does it really mean? And it has changed quite a while compared to recent years. This session is going to cover on what you see on the slide, foundational principles. Some of these, they're essentially, they're kind of foundations. They're items that we do that we need to keep in mind, such as empowering everyone across the institution so everyone gets access to geospatial technology. Also, we'll take a look at some of these pillars of success. I'm not going to go into them in detail right now, and then we'll get to them into the actual best practices. Like I said, the following sessions are how to get there. If you're not there, how to get there. We'll hear from some other panelists in the community, as well as how to manage some of these non-SAS components. We'll define what non-SAS is. We'll take a look at, particularly again for ArcGIS Pro, how do we make it available for everyone across the institution? So a little bit of kind of definition of a modern GIS. So when we think about time travel to 2004, that's when Facebook was founded. That's how old our students approximately were at that time. So that is our current students. And that's what our phones looked like, if we had phones at all. So obviously things have quite changed since these days. So that is the time that ArcGIS Desktop, particularly ArcMap, was released, and a little bit prior to that. So almost 17 years ago or so. So again, things have changed quite a lot since then. And how have they changed? So this old era, when we're just kind of looking at ArcMap as a GIS application, this old era, we had kind of quite a few restrictions, if you will. So for one, only GIS experts were able to do the work, and only a few people across the campus, they had the expertise, and it really wasn't available like that to everyone. We had to be constrained to the office or the lab. People had to go there to do the work. We had these complex applications that either we built or we worked with, and then of course complex workstations as well. The new era, things have changed quite drastically. We know now that GIS can be applicable to anyone on campus, any domain, any discipline. Lots of lightweight apps. And yesterday, if you were in some of the sessions, this came out. So these applications, they're simple. The learning curve of them is pretty much non-existent. Anyone can come in and start using geospatial technology. We can run them on any device. We can study. We can work anywhere. So things have changed quite well in terms of what modern GIS is. And of course, they have changed in terms of how we manage it, how we manage this modern GIS notion. So GIS today, lots and lots of different apps, really app for every need, like we talked about yesterday. There's field apps, that is mobile apps, there's all different kinds of dashboards, story maps. Of course, ArcGIS Pro is one of those apps, it's part of this modern GIS pattern, but it's not just ArcGIS Pro. So this modern pattern, you call it modern GIS or WebGIS, CloudGIS, SaaSGIS, you can call it many different things and you see it labeled many different things. But the fact is that it's not just desktop GIS. It's more than just desktop GIS. Desktop has not gone away, particularly ArcGIS Pro is an application, but we do need to start kind of thinking of this modern pattern that is app for every need approach. So bottom line, what is modern GIS? GIS tools for everyone's needs. So an app for every need. Software as a service is a very key component. And when we mean software as a service, it's ArcGIS Online and all of these apps. And then desktop GIS software, it's also still very much the core, still very much for any complex functions that we need to perform and so on, particularly ArcGIS Pro. Some of you that are still using ArcMap, we do highly advise that you're gonna adopt some of these modern thinking, modern apps, and evaluate how your educational objectives can be fulfilled with them. So with that, again, the notion here is that GIS has changed. Now we also have changed how we manage GIS. So at this point, I'm gonna stop sharing and I'm gonna let Peter start his share, and he's gonna sort of describe how we manage GIS in this modern GIS world and era.
Yeah, so picking up where Jerry left off, we're gonna get into more details in the initial outline slide now. So talking first here, the pillars of success for modern GIS, what makes this all possible? And let's look at each of these three individually. So first, treating ArcGIS as a resource for your entire institution. As Jerry pointed out, it's not just desktop anymore. It's not just a few units with GIS professionals in it. It's everyone on your campus using the software now. And so treating it as a resource for your entire institution, the Esri Education Institution Agreement covers your entire institution, which makes it easy. Central funding helps with that, but basically you're going to treat the system just like you do your email or your learning management system or some of your HR systems or productivity apps. It's a tool for everyone on your campus. Number two is leverage automation to scalably manage GIS. You're going to have a whole bunch of people using GIS. You don't necessarily want to have to hire a whole bunch of people to help manage it. So we're going to talk about how to automate things today. So regardless of how many users you have, it takes very little effort to manage the system. And then three, collaboration with stakeholders across your institution. That's sort of the key to getting this all to work. You know, a lot of us are GIS experts, but perhaps don't know anything about single sign-on or directory services. So working with someone in enterprise IT, working with someone in administration to help with that central funding, and supporting your community so that everyone can have access to all this wonderful software. So those are our sort of three pillars of success. How do we make this all work? And this is where we're going to get into all those different best practices for managing a modern GIS. So to start with, these are probably some of the questions, if you're involved with ArcGIS Online Management, that you found yourself asking. Is this person eligible for an account? Do they need an entitlement for GeoPlanner or the ArcGIS Pro Spatial Analyst extension? How many credits should I grant this user? To what role should I assign this person? And so on. And what I invite you instead is to ask three simple questions. What are reasonable defaults to empower everyone with everything GIS, give them access to everything? Who manages your single sign-on system and directory services for your institution? And who funds site licenses for institution-wide systems? So find the key stakeholders in the areas and build a collaboration with them. And what you'll find is that instead you can answer these questions with the best practices. So if you're asking, is this person eligible for an ArcGIS Assistant account? Well, that's not really your job. You're not keeping track of who's an enrolled student or not, or when a faculty member retires. Leave that up to the authoritative systems from your HR and registrar's office, which are hooked into your single sign-on service so that it knows who's authorized to access the system. Do they need an entitlement for GeoPlanner or the ArcGIS Pro Spatial Analyst? Well, we're going to set the system up to auto-provision everyone with entitlements for everything, so they don't have to ask for permission to access piecemeal. They'll just get it all. Related to that, of course, is how many credits should I grant this user? That's where you can ensure reasonable use of the system by auto-provisioning a reasonable credit allocation so that people can get the work done that they need to without having to ask for permission or credits to do it. Number 4, to what role should I assign this person? Again, you can auto-provision everyone with an empowered role so that they can take care of themselves. Number 5, what groups do they need to be in? Well, since you've given them an empowered role, users can manage their own groups, so they don't have to ask you to do that for them. Course groups you might even integrate with your LMS or your directory services to leverage other systems you may have that are already managing groups on your campus. Do they need access to every Esri training? Yeah, that's going to enable them to help themselves. So again, you can auto-provision Esri access, and they can get access to all the wonderful Esri training sites and learn lessons. How do I know when a student graduates so that I can disable the account? Well, this goes back to that first thing with the integration with SSO. It's going to take care of knowing when someone is no longer eligible to use the system and handle that for you automatically. Who is paying for this person's license? Well, again, when you're going to deploy this across your entire institution, it's really the ArcGIS technology is for everyone. And as we'll reiterate here in a bit, just the cost of recovering the site license when you have so many people using it across campus, it's just not worth doing. It's just much simpler to pay for it centrally. So when it comes to managing a modern GIS, I think it helps to split this into sort of 2 roles to think about here. And part of this is due to the workload that's associated with each. So most of the questions we just talked about are more tied to the administration of ArcGIS. So users, installers, licensing. These are all things that if you follow those best practices of single sign-on and other things we'll talk about in more detail in a second, the number of users you have and the amount of effort you have to give there's no increase. The more users you have, it's sort of a flat line thing. And it takes up very little of your time once you're implemented these best practices on an annual basis. Where you do have to consider investing is in supporting your users. So who can I ask for help with this tool? What is the best way to do this kind of analysis? When is your next workshop on georeferencing? These are the kinds of things where the more users you get, the more help they're going to need using the system. And so you need to be prepared for that to scale up as you get more users. So I'm going to go through some of these best practices now, one by one, starting with the education institution agreement. This is the thing that empowers your entire institution with Esri's ArcGIS technology. You get access to a number of things. You can follow this link. The slides will be available later. I can't click on it, of course, in Zoom, but this link will take you to one of the Esri pages explaining everything that's included in that license. And of course, one of the key things is the ArcGIS Online organizations. You get one for teaching and research and one for administration. The license terms are slightly different for those two, so you do need to have 2 organizations. You might even want a third if you're doing a lot of scripting with users or content. It's good to have a place to test those things out before you work with the real data. But one of the things here is that you want to minimize your management effort and costs. You don't want a whole bunch of organizations to manage. You don't need one for this research project or one for this unit, because then you start ending up with siloed data that's only available in individual organizations. If you need that sort of thing, consider using something like Hub instead, which gives you a public-facing website and a way to organize information for larger communities, but that can all be done within a single ArcGIS Online organization. Central funding, that's key to this switch here from the old era of desktop to the new area of everybody using everything. You're basically treating this as an institution-wide resource, so you might as well fund it at the institutional level, like a lot of the other institutional software on your campus. And often this may be as much or even more of a cultural change for your existing GIS community. This notion of moving off of desktop workstation only GIS to everybody being able to use all sorts of different things, lightweight and heavyweight GIS apps. Single sign-on and enterprise accounts. This is one of the key things that's going to save you a lot of time. It provides your users with a familiar login experience. So there's a screenshot here of what it looks like for our U of M users. They don't have to know a separate username and password to use this system. They can use the same credentials they use for other institutional systems. And since you're leveraging your campus's authoritative systems, you can leave it up to it to verify that or authenticate that someone is who they say they are, and also to sort out the authorization of, are they an alumni and shouldn't have access anymore? Are they an active student or an active faculty member? It takes care of all that for you automatically. When you do make this transition, one of the questions is, well, what do I do with all the existing ArcGIS accounts? If you have a lot, you can script this transition, create the new enterprise accounts, change ownership from the old user to the new user. But a lot of universities have simply found that simplest way is just to let those old accounts fade away. Maybe you've got a few power users you need to manually move over, but for the most part, just get people to start using the new accounts and the old ones will no longer be used over time. Another key piece here is new member defaults and auto provisioning. So once you've got single sign-on and enterprise accounts set up, you can use new member defaults with that to automatically join people to your ArcGIS Online organization the first time they log in. So if they go to your SSO, they log in, this tells ArcGIS Online they're authorized, then you're automatically going to provision their account with all the different licensing and add-on licenses that they need to do their GIS work. Give them a role like publisher. You probably want to add things like notebook, maybe even the ability to add shared update groups so they can take care of themselves for the most part. There is a little asterisk here after shared update. At the moment, there's a bit of a design flaw in new member defaults and that you can't create a custom role with shared update privileges and use it with new member defaults. So you have to do a little scripting behind the scenes to get people that permission. Credits I'll talk a bit about on the next slide. Esri access, that's the setting that's going to give them ability to go to the learn lessons and the Esri training sites where all the stuff that says site maintenance required is going to be free for them now that they're associated with your organization. It's also how they can easily get to GeoNet, or I guess as we call it now, the Esri community. So to say a little bit about credit allocations, this is really where you can control or help users keep from running away with the system. So limit how much the users can do rather than what they can do. Give them licenses for everything, but make sure you have credit budgeting enabled. And then choose a reasonable default allocation to use with new member defaults. And then we reset it at the start of every semester. So in our case, we give all of our users 10,000 credits. Now, it's important to remember that that's a limit. That's not the expected usage. And if we look at some stats over the last year, we're a large institution site license, so we get 5 million credits from Esri. We used less than 1 million, so less than 20% of the credits over that year. And the average per user is 67 credits for around 7,000 users. And the median is basically 0. There's a lot of people using lightweight apps and other pieces of ArcGIS that actually don't cost a thing for them to get their job done. In fact, we only have 150 users who used more than that average. And then even though we have the very high limit of 10,000, we still had 16 users hit that limit. So we had to deal with those use cases. Best practices for ArcGIS Pro Licensing. These days, the simplest thing to do is just to give everyone a named user license. They get that automatically when they're provisioned, when they log in that first time. Internet access is required, so it's our preferred method for on-campus usage. We do also recommend you disable the offline option that lets people check their named user license out onto their laptop or something else to use offline, partly because once you've done that, you're restricted to that one machine until it's checked back in. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who has stories of faculty members checking it out onto their laptop or a student or something, and then leaving the laptop at home, get into their office, sit in front of the computer, and suddenly they can't use ArcGIS Pro. Or maybe they checked it out onto a loaner laptop or into a virtual machine, which they no longer have access to. And then that requires contacting Esri support, and it can take a while to get the license reactivated. So instead, if people are going to be offline or they're working off campus or using laptops, personally owned devices, we strongly suggest they use single-use licensing instead. And we make the provision and file for that available from one of our institutional file shares. So they have to log in to get to it, but it's all self-service. Concurrent use licensing, a lot of us are probably familiar with that from ArcGIS desktop days, but you no longer need that with Pro. The only situations we still use it for on our campus is when you have air-gapped or non-internet connected environments or secure enclaves. Otherwise, you can retire that license server and save yourself some money and time by switching to just using named user and single-use licensing. Software licensing and distribution. Well, most people are after ArcGIS Pro, and that's really easy to get now. The simplest option is just to log into your institution's ArcGIS Online organization. And if you've got single sign-on and new member defaults all set up, that automatically is going to assign them a named user license. They can then go to My Settings and download the Pro installer right from there. Now, that's Pro only. It doesn't have data interoperability. It doesn't have the database components or other things. And we'll talk about that in the next slide. But then their next step is just to install ArcGIS Pro, and they're good to go. We do recommend that folks set the institution's ArcGIS Online organization as their active portal and license server, because that just simplifies using Pro when they log in each time. So they're already connected to your organization. And you can do that in the settings in Pro. Now, for everything else ArcGIS and all those other pieces of Pro that aren't included behind that download button, we don't recommend using My Esri. It requires manually managing users, and eventually you may get to 7,000 like we are. That just doesn't scale. We can't deal with that many individual things. And so instead, the best practice is to set up self-service software and licensing distribution for your general use ArcGIS applications. And you can do this using a combination of something like Experience Builder or a hub site where you have instructions and links to installers and license provisioning files. There's a link here. You can check out our U of M Experience Builder site. And then the actual downloads and license provisioning files, host that somewhere on your institutional file systems that uses the same single sign-on solution. So again, it's already taken care of controlling who's authorized. If you go visit our Experience Builder site, you're welcome to click on any of the links to downloads and installers, but you won't get there because you won't have access to it on Google Drive through our organization. And then for the more advanced things like ArcGIS Enterprise and other things, we have those available upon request via Google Drive. This seems like a small thing, but it can really save a lot of headaches. The ArcGIS Online login experience is to customize it so that all the user sees is your single sign-on solution. So these two choices here on the right. Otherwise, by default, they'll get dumped into the regular generic ArcGIS on login. They'll type in their university credentials, and it won't let them log in. And then they'll send a forgot password or forgot username request. And it's just really a way to avoid this confusion, the extraneous emails. All it is they've forgotten that they need to select organization, enter their organization, and then get to their single sign-on. If you configure it so you disable ArcGIS logins, disable social logins, and just enable the SAML ones, they're going to go straight there. We do recommend that you share some documentation on the web or a video of your login steps, because it's really easy to point to that in an email when you send them, hey, I can't reset your password. You just need to go here to log in through the SSO. For anyone using Hub Premium, there are some interactions you do want to keep aware of in terms of what choices you make here and how that's going to impact the partnered Hub Premium organization instance, but we don't have time to get into that today. So another question that comes up a lot is, what should I do when users leave? And the best practice for right now is do nothing, just sit on your hands for the time being. Partly because tools don't exist to handle this issue at scale automatically, at least not yet. And new use continues to overwhelm old use. So it's not really a serious problem yet. So for instance, at U of M, our old users' accounts and their content account for less than 7% of our annual credit consumption after 9 years. And in part, that's just due satellite image resolution is higher, drone imagery is higher resolution and bigger. The pictures we take with our mobile devices and attach in Collector and Survey 1 to 3 take up more storage space than they did when Collector first came out. And we have more users joining every year. Our user base is still growing, it's still accelerating. So it's always swamping out, it seems, what we have with the old users. But even though you may not be doing anything, we do strongly recommend that you develop guidelines for retention. So we cannot guarantee how long your ArcGIS Online content will be retained after you leave. However, we do not currently plan to delete it immediately upon your departure. And then you might say, oh, after 2 years, we're going to delete it or something. But one of the important things to keep in mind is that guidelines are not policies. You don't have to enforce the guidelines. So if you have some statements in place, though, that'll make your life a lot easier down the road. So we proactively share guidelines. That's another best practice we recommend. We periodically email users, especially students, to remind them, not necessarily in the last week of the semester when they're busy doing finals and maybe they're about to graduate and they don't want them panicking about losing their access then. So we send it usually a month and a half or so before the end of the semester. We also have them posted on the web so that you can refer to people. You're welcome to check out our U of M guidelines. And then we also include in there guidance for transferring content, which we'll talk a bit more about transferring here in a second, but just to give them some ideas of where they can go. If they're about to graduate, they've got that month and a half to sort things out. Now, this works great, except when your institution has actual policies limiting data retention. And at this point in time, you really your only option is to use something like scripting with ArcGIS API for Python or the REST API to sort of do this at scale. You can always go in through the user interface as an admin, but that's all manual. And if you have to do this for a lot of students, that's a lot of time spent doing it. One thing I would recommend doing is that most of the time institutions' policies are about making sure there's nothing tied to the user. And so one of the things you can do in terms of archiving before deleting is just simply disassociate the content from an identifiable user. So change the ownership from a student, say, to some generic account, and unshare it from all the groups and other sharing that might be enabled. So you still have the content there just in case someone comes along, maybe a student has done something for a faculty member and graduated and left, and then the faculty member wants to do something and realizes they don't have access to it, or they see all of a sudden their web page stops working because the student, you've archived the content, but it's still there, so you can pull it back and potentially fix the problem. So transferring content, it's not really as simple as it should be in ArcGIS Online, and hopefully the work that's being done by Esri and others will make this better. But I mean, part of the challenge is, well, what do people mean when they say transfer? Is it one item that stays one item, like you're just changing ownership or moving it to a different ArcGIS Online organization? Or by transfer, do you want one item to become two items? So think of like save as for a web map, or duplicate with a story map. So you end up with one copy that can be owned by one person and one copy owned by another person, or again, transferred to a different organization. It gets more complicated with a lot of the cool things you can do in ArcGIS, because of course you have things like web maps, which can reference hosted feature layers. So when you talk about transferring the web map, do you want to transfer only the web map and it'll still point to the original two feature layers? Or do you want to transfer both the web map and those hosted feature layers so that you have copies of each, and then the web map has to be swizzled so that it points to the new feature layers and not the old ones? So you can see this begins to get pretty complicated, especially as you deal with some of the more complicated item types in ArcGIS Online. And so what can we do right now? Well, there's no single solution for all item types at the moment. There is the ArcGIS Assistant tool, and if you haven't checked this out, it's got a nice interface for working with individual items. You may have used the ArcGIS Online Assistant tool in the past. This is an evolution of that with better support. It's got documentation, a user guide. But again, it's still just individual items, and it does not copy or swizzle referenced items, though you can use that to do it manually. So in that last example, I could copy the web map, I could copy the first feature layer, I could copy the second feature layer, all with ArcGIS Assistant, and then go back in ArcGIS Assistant and edit the web map to swizzle it to point to those new copies of the map layers. The other option is the ArcGIS API for Python. The clone items method is very powerful. It works for most item types, and it can copy and swizzle referenced items for some item types. So I could use it to make a copy of that web map and have it copy those two feature layers as well. And there's a nice example notebook for cloning content. There's some good examples in there. We often get asked to clone story maps on our campus, the new story map format. And of course, story maps contain web maps, which contain feature layers. And so we wrote a little notebook that helps with that. So it clones not just the story map itself, which is effectively what the duplicate story map function does in the interface, but it will also clone any web maps or web scenes or feature layers referenced by those web maps or web scenes that are owned by the same author as the story map. So you can end up with an exact duplicate of your story map, either on the same organization or in a different organization. So it's a handy way to transfer story maps between organizations. So how do I do modern GIS at my institution? Well, there's many successful patterns. Almost all of them involve stakeholders in GIS and enterprise IT and administration working together and faculty helping drive it along. And you can join us in the next section to hear more of these. But I wanted to call out one particular usage pattern, which some of you may fall into, and that's that innovative faculty member using it in their own class. How do you get from there to institution-wide? A lot of these best practices, the pillars of success, things we're talking about, that's not really pertinent if you're just doing this all for yourself in a class. But I want you to think about the bigger picture here. How do you go from you as the superhero, map woman or map man, to enabling your whole campus of superheroes? And this is really an oft-repeated pattern with IT. I mean, you may remember back when email servers were run by individual faculty, or then by departments, or then by colleges. And these days it's handed off to Microsoft and Google as software as a service. Web servers, there may be some of you running even on your own web servers right now. Learning management systems, or a lot of innovative faculty that stood up a Moodle or a Sakai instance instance to use for their particular class. But eventually those became systems that the colleges adopted as a whole. So how do you move from that early adoption to an enterprise system in the past on your campus? Talking to some of those people could be a good starting point on figuring out the path for your own institution. And then once you're following these once you are a modern GIS campus following these best practices, just setting some expectations here to keep in mind. So the administration of ArcGIS, the supporting the software, this is something where you're going to see your workload go down if you have a lot of users, or at least flatten. So for instance, over the last year, we had 18 people contact us about forgotten passwords. But again, that was a really quick email to do, because it's not that they forgot their password, they forgot to use the single sign-on. And so we've got a canned email we can send them. 16 users triggered the credit allocation exception. They were all geocoding related, so a quick conversation with them to find out what they were up to and get them on the right track and give them more credits, and they're off and running. We had 55 emails this past year dealing with pro and desktop licensing issues. Usually we only have a dozen or so. One of the things that caught us out this year is that most of these emails were related to bogus pro license expiration warnings. So as we got near the renewal dates for our ArcGIS Online instance, users started getting expiration messages for pro, even though we had already renewed our license. And that happened right up until the day that the license renewed. But you can imagine that put a lot of panic in students and faculty who are in the middle of doing things and thought the software was going to disappear on them. Hopefully that number will go back down next year. Now, when it comes to in terms of supporting the use of ArcGIS, supporting the people using the software, this is where you can see a workload increase. We had about 750 requests for GIS assistants on our Ann Arbor campus last year. And in the unit I'm in, the College of Literature, Science, and the Art, we went from having 0 people providing GIS support to 2.25 FTEs in 2019. And it's probably getting time again for us to revisit that as the usage continues to snowball. So to wrap things up and get on to the Q&A, hopefully you guys have some questions we can help with today. Sort of summarizing everything that Jerry and I have said, it's really this foundational principle of empowering everyone with everything GIS is the goal here. And to really succeed at that and follow the best practices, it's really the approach of treating GIS as a resource for your entire institution, things like centrally funding the agreement, and leveraging all this automation to make it scalable to manage GIS. So you can spend very little time managing the software once you've set up single sign-on, enterprise accounts, pick some new member defaults to work with. But you can't generally do this on your own. You really need to collaborate with key stakeholders across your institution in GIS, and IT administration, and faculty. And I'll pause here for questions.
All right, so thanks, Peter. So there are a number of wonderful questions that came through. So I'm going to read a couple of them, and I'll let you answer them, or I'll help with some of the answers. But the first question that came was from Diane Fritz, and she asked, any thoughts about how to implement multiple SSOs for a single organization? So their library serves 3 institutions, so multiple single sign-on systems to serve 3 different institutions.
I think we'd need someone from Esri's tech support to answer that one. In the past, they did not have support for more than one. I believe they're working on it. And if I recall, last time I looked at the settings, there was support for some of the things like, and I'm forgetting the name in common, some of these federations of SSOs. So one option might be to federate your SSOs under one umbrella and use that as your single sign-on solution. The other is to potentially talk with your enterprise IT folks. Maybe they're already working on a project to go to a single sign-on. We had separate ones for our Dearborn, Flint, and Ann Arbor campus, and undertook a project a couple of years ago to bring them all in under a single umbrella, because it makes it a lot easier, not just for ArcGIS, but all the other institution-wide systems.
Yeah, so then that was going to be my recommendation to you as well. Just reach out to your IT folks, just in terms of, we have seen some of that transition that Peter just described. So many campuses, single, obviously, either library or center serves multiple locations within the institution, multiple campuses, if you will. So it's not quite uncommon. So do start the conversation with them as well as to how they're handling it for different systems. All right, so next question, Peter. So in your opinion, what are the key questions to ask my IT folks about our small universities licensing in order to determine what my capabilities are as an instructor? So what are the key questions to ask my IT folks about my small university licensing?
I mean, it's kind of tongue in cheek, but the first one is, do you guys want to save money? I think you certainly hear some stories in the next section about all these recharge and cost recovery mechanisms people used to go through when it was just individual instructors using it and whatnot, and they've all found that it's just way less expensive to do this at a university-wide level. And now my screen has just jumped, so I lost track of what the question was.
Just various questions or items to approach your IT folks with.
Yeah. And so the IT folks are generally going to be, quite familiar with single sign-on and enterprise accounts and directory services, because they're doing that for all sorts of systems. When you log into your Google or your Microsoft productivity suite in your campus, you're probably using a university ID for that. When you log in your HR system, it's probably the same one. So finding out who those folks are and, just talking about them, how you can enable that. So the central funding and the tech support you need for putting those together. So the questions, perhaps, are, if you've already found the right IT group, they will know what you mean when you're talking about single sign-on and others. But if you're not quite sure which IT group to ask, see if you can track down the ones that are tied to your productivity, your agreements with Microsoft and Google and others, or your LMS. You're probably logging in that using your university ID. So you could reach out to those folks and find out who the right IT group is to talk to about that. Hope that answers that question.
Exactly. I think hopefully it does. If not, please feel free to type more. So a few folks asked about guidelines based upon the recommendations that you, Peter, discussed in terms of what you provided Michigan. So I posted some links. I posted them in the Q&A, and I just put them in the chat as well. So wanted to make that available for folks. And then there's another question that came in terms of links to the presentation, and then recording. All of that is going to be available on the proceedings, and that also was addressed in the Q&A. Another question that came in, so what are the options for those universities or organizations who don't have Esri ArcGIS access? What are the options for those university students? So Rafsan, again, we may need a little bit more clarification here, but in terms of, assuming that you have either an institution agreement that covers the whole institution or a departmental license, which covers at least a certain department. So assuming you actually have Esri licensing, if you're referring to Esri enabled access, which gives you the ability to, so what like Peter talked about in the beginning, get access to training resources, being able to log into the Esri community and such. So Esri access is something that can be enabled, and we recommend that it is enabled by default. Peter talked a little bit about new member defaults. So it can be done that way. That's what we recommend. Of course, it can be done through the ArcGIS online organization as well. So again, the point of it is to enable Esri access for everyone at the institutions. They can get access to those training resources and so on. If you are referring to, if you don't have access to the ArcGIS license, or you don't have the license in general, so that's something to, depending on where you are, just work with either from local distributor or reach out to us at highered@esri.com, and I'll put that email in the chat here. So hopefully that addresses that question. Peter, here's one. Is there any way to retrieve discarded story map from my college account? So is there a way to retrieve discarded story map from my college account?
Partly it depends on what you mean by discarded. If your story map is still there, but you can't log in anymore, you could actually use, and the story map is publicly shared, you could use that Python notebook we provided a link for cloning story maps to actually copy it, say, to your new organization where you are now, or to a personal use organization if you have your own. If it's not publicly visible, then you would have to reach out to the administrators of your former ArcGIS Online instance and work with them. Maybe it's still there and they haven't deleted it. All of our content is still there. We haven't deleted it, and you can work with them. If they have actually deleted it, then unfortunately there's nothing you can do at that point.
Okay, great. Thank you, Peter. So Peter, here's a fantastic question that came in. Do you find that departments in your institution naturally find uses for GIS and instigate ArcGIS use requests, or do you develop publicity material to showcase use?
I'd say a combination of the two, and this may be an artifact of being a large institution. It's just 7,000 users. I think one of the keys to success is when you have no idea what people are using the system for. It's not like your email administrators are reading every single email to see what people are doing with it, or reading every Word doc to see what they're doing. So a lot of it is just making it available out there. And they may see something in their domain, someone else at another university showed something off, and they come back and they sit down and they Google a little bit and find, oh, there's an ArcGIS OnLog guy in Michigan. Let me give that a try. So a lot of it is just users finding it on their own. I mean, we do workshops. We do have websites people can find, but we don't really wander around campus with placards saying, hey, use GIS. We've thought about it. But we don't really have we don't have a good channel to advertise to everybody what's available there.
Wonderful, thank you. And I would add to that, so for whoever asked that question, in our next session, we are going to talk about basically how do we get to these best practices state. We'll hear from some panelists that have sort of recently walked that road, done everything that Peter just described, but also they spend a lot of time sort of supporting users on campus. And as part of that role, they'll go into some details on what are some of these things and functions that they do that could help as well. So if you're interested in learning about that, you're welcome to join us in this next session. So here's another question that came in. Is it possible for an institution to have a license on ArcGIS Pro and share the license among students within the institution? So it's an interesting question. And again, a couple of different things. I'll take a stab, and Peter, you can jump in. The way ArcGIS Pro is licensed in a couple of different ways. And Peter went over that. The recommended way is through a named user in ArcGIS Online. So when they open up ArcGIS Pro, they'll be asked to enter credentials. So basically, licensing is done via ArcGIS Online, and that is what we recommend. So as such, we can't really, the license cannot be shared per se. People and the individual students, faculty, staff across the institution need to have their own login, and obviously ArcGIS Online, and that's what they're going to be using to license ArcGIS Pro. Peter, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes too, that's also that mental change you need to make of, we used to work in standalone Word, and now everyone collaborates in Google Docs. So it's just natural now in a lot of software. The first thing you do is log in because it's tied to something up in the cloud to make it easy to share things. I think the other piece of this question perhaps is, if you're not internet access enabled, one of the best practices we recommend is making that single use license available for all of your students to use it for university related teaching and research. But you make it available not by publishing it to the world, but by putting it somewhere on your campus that requires them to sign in to access it and download it.
Yeah, so hopefully that addresses the question. Something else, I'm going to put another link here in the chat to the ArcGIS Assistant. This came up, Peter discussed it briefly in one of the slides, and it also came up in one of the questions, but it's a relatively new tool. It's one of the options that gives us the ability to manage users, manage content, transfer content and such. So if you haven't used it, please take a look. You might have seen the predecessor of that tool. It's called the AGO Assistant. It's very, very handy. It's not, it's more so used as a self-serve option. So if you or if someone else wants to go in and transfer content, either between two different organizations or within the organization itself, it's not the best solution or the solution for everything that we may want to do. It's not the scalable per se, but it's a pretty nice tool to be able to perform some of those functions. So feel free to take a look at that tool. And then another question that came, are the GIS tools ADA compliant by default? So there's ADA compliancy, and there's a nice section of the website that we have And then I don't know if Peter, you want to share anything to that. If we have time, I can try to look it up and share it in the chat. If not, just
I'll
look
talk
up
for a bit while Jerry looks for URLs.
Esri ADA compliance.
Yeah, you know, a lot of the desktop applications like Pro and City Engine and Insights take advantage of the operating system support for ADA compliance. A lot of the web tools, you know, each team developed them makes their own shot at having ADA compliance, and a lot of them meet the WCAG 2.0 guidelines. And a number of them have a VPAT document which describes how well they meet them. I know the Story Map team, we actually recently did a review of how well they supported ADA stuff, and it was basically met our university standards for it. It's almost impossible to support them 100% on every platform and every device, but they come pretty close.
All right, wonderful. And thank you everyone for attending and joining us, for the great question. And thanks, Peter, for all the shared successes and best practices. And the session will end now.